All right, and continuing on from the last video, Nelson.
Okay, so we have to deal with objects, and objects aren't going to be as simple as what we have here before. I suppose we could do something like what we have with the array builder, but I want to introduce a concept of ANTLR that's very powerful, and especially very powerful when you're talking about nested stuff. And that feature is called dynamic scoping. So with object, we have two rules. We have the object rule and the object property rule. Now, just like before, object is going to returns a iValue builder. And of course, we're going to assign the return value of our value rule to object.builder. So standard stuff so far. What gets interesting is we're going to have this object property rule. We're delegating out to the object property rule. And the object property rule, I'm going to have it access a value inside of the object rule that isn't going to be returned out of the object property rule. Now in ANTLR, you have this really cool concept of scoping. And scoping, think about scoping, you previously thought about rules like methods, because they are methods. But what's cool about scoping in ANTLR, imagine if your methods had properties. And imagine if you could access those properties deep down in the call stack of the closest method that has that property in the call stack. You can even do more advanced stuff. You can access the entire stack if you wanted to. But think about a call stack in a Visual Studio debugger. And imagine if every one of those little items in the call stack actually was able to contain data. And you were able to access that data recursively. So that's really cool. And the reason we need it, though, is because we need object property to be able to access a property in the object rule of the closest object that it relates to. Because remember, objects can be nested. Mm-hmm. So we can't access just any object rule. We have to be able to find a way to attach a property to a method, which is kind of an interesting concept. I really like how scopes work in ANTLR. This sort of stuff will become very, very, very much more apparent when we build the language, because with languages, you have nested blocks, nested expressions, nested methods, nested classes, and all that stuff. But in this case, we just have nested objects. So you start with defining a scope by doing this. And so remember, the scope keyword comes after the returns, but before the colon, and it's the scope keyword followed by an open and close curly. Inside of the scope curlies, we can add our properties. So what I've done is I've added a property to a method, which if you're not familiar, if you've never done that before, which you probably haven't, it sounds very bizarre, but you'll see how it becomes really awesome in a second. The next thing we're going to do is, because in ANTLR you can't actually initialize your properties in scopes inline inside this block, so I'm going to immediately open up the rule with the colon and open up another action that we can take inside of this rule. And all this action is going to do is it's going to say the return value of builder equals our dynamic scoped builder equals new object builder. So this is the syntax that you access the properties on these rules. And so this syntax will access the closest nested rule that matches the name, in this case object, and access the object builder property on it. So now that we've defined this object builder property, every rule that object might ever jump into, and remember, object goes to object property, goes to value, goes to object array or literal, and so on. So it's very recursive. So remember, this will access the closest object rules property. In this case, it's going to be the object rule that we're in itself, but it's going to become a lot more interesting once we get into the object property rule. So that's about it for here, because at least for the object rule, because we're assigning our return value to our dynamic scope to a new instantiation of an object builder. So how do we access that within our object property? Well, it's very, very straightforward, actually. All we have to do is say object : object builder dot, And then we can invoke the set property method on it, because remember, Object Builder has this set property method on it that takes in a key and another builder. And then we're going to pass in the ident or the string followed by the value. And this becomes a very interesting problem, because how do we match both the ident or the string? Well, we simply say, let's just say key equals. So we're actually aliasing out ident or string into another variable that we can access in our actions. So we can say key.text for our key and value.builder for our builder. So if this makes your head hurt, well,
I don't think it was that bad.
okay. Yeah, just remember that this object property, when you see the syntax object : object builder, we are going to be accessing the property on the closest object. Basically, actually, if I go ahead and do a Control-Shift build and jump over to our generated Elixir, check this out. This is what that actually looks like. We have this object stack. And this object stack is a field on our class that's going to be pushed every time an object rule is matched. So we see down here, we see object stack.peak. So get the closest object stack object that we can, .object builder, which is our property, .set property, which is the method that we want to invoke.
Cool.
So yeah.
Okay. Well, that's going to wrap things up for this video, and we'll see you guys in the next. Thanks a lot.